Hey, greetings and welcome to week 5. This is going to be lecture 1. So this far, we in our lectures we've talked a lot about the theoretical and biblical foundations for neighboring. We've talked about some of the bigger sort of meta, larger situations that shape our understanding and our perspectives about neighboring, especially in the West. We've talked about things like fear and busyness. We've talked about the postures of neighboring and the movement of neighboring, how we begin to move towards our neighbor. We talked about the kind of way in which we conduct ourselves and carry ourselves in terms of empathy and mercy and those key elements that kind of factor into how we understand our lives in the neighboring relationships that we have. Today, I want to spend some time to you talking a little bit about some practical tips for us in terms of Christian neighboring. This week has been, I think, explicitly practical. We just finished reading the book Art of Neighboring. We've completed our oikos mapping. And now I want to keep us in that vein, right? I don't want to break us out and then move back into theory. I want us to really root in here and spend some time thinking about the real practical applications and implications of neighboring and some of the challenges we might find. So what I'm going to offer to you is the 10 saboteurs of Christian neighboring, okay? So I want to walk through these. I think these are things that I've collected, and in your responses, what I would love for you to do is maybe pick out 2 or 3 of them that you find yourself most prone to that could end up sabotaging your desire, your connection to the neighbors around you as you seek to build relationships with those outside the walls of the church. All right, so these are the 10 saboteurs of Christian neighboring. Number 1 is what I'm going to call insincerity or maybe gospel manipulation. Here's the challenge I think I have with Christians. As those who are often trained in terms of personal evangelism, we tend to enter into relationships with a so that in mind. We engage people, we build friendships so that at some point they'll make a decision, they'll accept Jesus, they'll become a Christian, right? So there's already that sense of expectation on the front end that my relationship with this person will ultimately lead towards a salvation prayer. Now, please hear me say this. I am continually committed to being a good newser, one who believes that Jesus is the hinge on which all human history spins and turns. I believe that the best life is the Jesus life. And I would hope that the relationships I forge with others would see something in my life demonstrated in the way I live, the way I act, the way I carry myself, the way I conduct myself, the way I care for those around me, that might eventually lead to them asking questions that I began to ask about this whole Jesus story. But I also want to make sure that we don't enter into what I call gospel manipulation. This is when we begin to measure our relationships by the speed at which we can get somebody to make a decision. And that we value that relationship only in terms of its proximity to, and I've heard language used like this in terms of personal evangelism, closing the deal. And I feel like that is manipulative. There should be something organically beautiful and emergent about the kinds of relationships that we forge that might ultimately lead to someone making a decision for Jesus. But even in the absence of that decision, that shouldn't devalue the relationship we're in with folks. Because our proximity, our presence, our love, their love for us, their care for us, the shared space of peacemaking, all of that is holy and kingdom-minded. So even if the relationship I forge with somebody doesn't ultimately lead towards a decision that they will make to share the faith that I embrace, it doesn't devalue that relationship. So we ought to enter into that relationship with a sense of openness, embracing people for who they are and how they are, rather than expecting them to hurry up and meet me where I am. And so I want to say that insincerity will often be picked up by people who would begin to see in us a manipulation of conversation or movements or pressures to get them to do something that they haven't yet done, or say something that they haven't yet said, or pray something they haven't yet prayed. And I think that becomes a saboteur for us in terms of our Christian neighboring. But again, I'm pretty committed to good newsing. So if there's an opportunity that presents itself organically, then yeah, take that advantage to share the hope that you have. I think we ought to always be prepared to do that. The second saboteur is this: collecting friends as trophies. Now here's what I mean by this one, and I want to make sure I'm not too hyperbolic this, but I see this happen a lot with Christians. So we grow up in church, we spend a lot of our time in church, we find that most of our relationships are with churched folks, and then the Spirit of God begins to move in our lives. We begin to realize that the mission of God is calling us outside the walls of the church. And we come into contact with writers who talk about engaging the other, right, in difference and diversity. And so in pursuit of that, we move outside the church, outside the walls of the church, looking for those diverse relationships with the other, right? And unintentionally, because we're now caught up in this desire to be missional and move outside the church, we begin to collect the other as a set of trophies that we can show off to our friends, or that we can talk about as often as we can. I'm in relationships with, I've got a black friend, or I've got a gay friend, or I've got a Buddhist friend, right? And what we're saying there is that I'm doing what I ought to be doing. I've got these people who are emblematic of my engagement with the other. Now, I'm not saying that you won't have those friends and that those friends aren't necessary, but I want to make sure that we're not just simply show and telling our friends to our other Christian friends to show that we are someone committed to diversity. That the relationships that we forge are representative of the organic situations that we find ourselves in, the places that we inhabit, the people that we move through. And that those relationships are about a mutuality and a shared life, and not just simply to be able to say that I'm missional because I've got this group of friends. Recognizing that those friends didn't enter into a relationship with you so you can be shown, they can be shown off to your Christian friends. Those people invested in a relationship with you because they cared enough about you to create space for them and you in their lives. And so I would encourage you that make sure that your friendships aren't based out of this desire to simply show that you've got difference in your lives, and that you're truly valuing those that God has placed in your life for the differences that they have, not merely to show them off to the Christian friends that you already have. So that's number two. So we have insincerity and we have collecting friends as trophies. Number three is what I call the failed follow-up. You know what this means, is you meet someone, you connect with someone, you have a few conversations, and then you begin to talk about how you ought to get together. And for whatever reason, you don't text them, they don't text you, you don't text them, you don't text them, you don't call them, you don't text them, you don't call them, and then you find yourself at the coffee shop or at the ballpark or at the library or wherever you are, and you run into them, and it's sort of awkward because neither of you made the connection and you don't really pursue it. And so this opportunity you had to forge a relationship with someone in a meaningful way sort of came and went, and you didn't follow up. And what happens to us is, the longer we don't follow up with someone, the more we give ourselves the excuse not to do so, because to do so would seem awkward now or embarrassing, right? And I want to encourage you that you'll be surprised that even if it's a few weeks since you met that person, or that last time you said, well, hey, I'm going to connect, or we'll get together. Generally, they're pretty excited when you finally do say, yes, let's do this. And it's very simple. You don't have to even make excuses. You can just call someone and say, hey, I am so sorry. I should have done this earlier, but how about we get that cup of coffee? And people will go, hey, thanks. Yeah, no, that'd be great. I mean, it's been a busy week for me too, or a busy few weeks, but I really appreciate you reaching out. It's great to have you do that. The fourth one in this list of 10, I think, follows right alongside the backside of the failed follow-up. And it's this, and I think it's born out of that same sense of embarrassment, and that is the missed event. So the failed follow-up is, hey, we were going to make a connection, we didn't, and then I didn't pursue it, and then it felt awkward, and then I got embarrassed, and then I didn't do it. The missed event is something significant happened in someone's life. It could have been a death, a tragedy. It could have been a birth. It could have been a job change or a job loss. It could have been some sort of financial thing. It could have been a sickness. Something significant takes place in someone's life that you've been working in a relationship to neighbor well, and you missed it. You blew it. You didn't see it. You didn't hear about it, or you did see it and you were at a place in your life where you couldn't necessarily respond to it in that moment. And it sort of left you in this place where you didn't do what you ought to have done. You didn't say what you ought to have said. You didn't engage in the way you ought to have engaged. You didn't care in the way that you ought to have cared. And so when that happens, then it becomes super awkward because now there's this gigantic elephant sitting in the room that you haven't named and you haven't dealt with. And one of the things that I want to encourage you to do is that when you begin to realize that is the case, again, it requires great humility on the part of the person who's seeking to be a good neighbor. It's to come up, come in, step in and say, hey, you know what? I'm going to be honest with you. I blew that. You had something happen and I was not there. And I am sorry, and I want to be there with you. I hope you can see to forgive me. I'm not going to make any excuses. And you might have had justifiable excuses. You might have missed a Facebook post. You might have had a lot going on in your own life. But in that moment, there's no necessity in making excuses. You just simply say, I don't have any excuses. I just want you to know I do care, and I do love you, and I'm sorry for missing this significant element in your life. And so I think that's a big step that we can take. So the first one is this sense of insincerity or gospel manipulation. The second one is collecting friends like trophies. The third one is the failed follow-up. And the fourth one is the missed event. Both of the last two that leads to this sense of embarrassment or awkwardness that we have to overcome. In the next lecture, I'll pick up the next few saboteurs to our neighboring.